Good morning, and thank you very much to all of you for joining us today for the CRTG Working Group Expert Briefing Series of 2020. I am Cecilia Polizzi, the founding director of the CRTG Working Group, and I'm really excited to bring to you an extinguished expert to discuss the issue of children exploitation by the Islamic State of Iraq and Al-Sham. The Islamic State has changed the nature of child participation in armed conflict and terrorism. Reportedly, boys under 18 years of age have been executed, either beheaded or shot, for suspected affiliation with other armed groups, and torture, mass forced enslavement, and sexual violence have been practiced against children as young as 10 years old, mostly from the Yazidi religious minorities in Iraq. However, children have not only been extensively targeted by the group, but they also witnessed and perpetrated IS executions. The tactical benefit in using children as an effective form of psychological warfare were in fact combined with the group intention to prioritize children as a vehicle to propagate its dogma for future generations. The group ambition to create and impose a new socio-political order depended on children as a means to realize its perspectives of longevity. The recruitment of children by the Islamic State has therefore been deliberate, calculated, systematic, and purposeful, imposing of dogma and barbarity on innocent children and constituting enormous challenges to the pursuit of accountability and justice, rehabilitation, and reintegration efforts. The magnitude of this humanitarian catastrophe needs further discussion, and so I'm truly delighted to introduce to you our guest speaker, Sareta Ashraph. Sareta Ashraph is the Principal Legal Officer in the Office of Field Investigation at the United Nations Investigative Team to promote accountability for crimes committed by Daesh. She is a barrister specializing in international criminal law with expertise in the gendered commission and impact of international crimes, notably genocide. Prior to joining UNITAD, she was a senior legal consultant to a number of projects focused on case building in relation to crimes committed in Syria and Iraq. In 2017, Sareta was part of the startup team of the International, Impartial, and Independent Mechanism. From May 2012 to November 2016, she served as a chief legal analyst of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Syria, documenting violation of international law in the context of the ongoing conflict. Immediately prior to this, she occupied the same position on the Commission of Inquiry on Libya. In 2010 and 2011, Sareta was the legal advisor to the International Criminal Court Office of the Public Counsel for Defense, and Sareta was also defense counsel before of the Special Court of Sierra Leone. She is currently visiting fellow at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford, an associate member of Garden Court Chambers of London, and is called to the Bar of England and Wales, as well as to the Bar of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Sareta, welcome. It's an immense pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for introducing me so well. I'm the current Principal Legal Officer with UNITAD's Office of Field Investigations. And I'm here on behalf of UNITAD to speak a little bit about ISIL's use of child soldiers, and then I'll be discussing a little bit more about UNITAD's particular approach to this topic. I'm just going to use a PowerPoint for the first, probably the first, the bulk of the presentation, and then a little bit of piece towards the end. So I'll share my screen. Is that the best way to do it?
Of course, Sareta, thank you.
Oh, you've disabled attendee screen sharing.
Allow me to share it for you, Sareta, so perhaps it's easier for us.
Okay, that's fine. You just, I'll tell you that then to move on from one slide to another. Or you can make me a co-host temporarily and then I can share, I think, is another way of doing it.
Is it visible to everybody?
Yeah, that's fine. You know, I just have to kind of, I'm trying to remember, because I now can't see what's on the other slides, but I'll try and remember what's in each slide so it looks easier. Yeah, thank you everyone. As I mentioned, I'm with UNITAD, and I'm going to speak a little bit about ISIL's use of child soldiers. Just to emphasize that UNITAD was, as you may know, was created by the UN Security Council Resolution 2379 in 2017 with the mandate to build, collect, preserve, analyze evidence of ISIL crimes in Iraq to the best international standards and for the purposes of criminal accountability, primarily in the courts of Iraq, but also globally, as well as to promote the cause of global accountability for ISIL crimes more globally. UNITAD works with national prosecutors across the world, and particularly because it's embedded in Iraq, we also have a capacity building role in Iraq, including training of judiciary and working with the services in Iraq. I'll speak a little bit more about the kind of jurisdictional challenges that we're facing when it comes to accountability, criminal prosecutions of ISIL crimes, including ISIL's use of child soldiers, who are generally known as cubs of the Caliphate, which is, if you're looking at ISIL shows, you'll see that phrase quite a lot. You can move over to the first slide. One of the key things is that ISIL is not an organization across any of its crimes attempts to hide or reframe its criminal activities. So where you might have seen in some armed groups, they tend to downplay their use of children, for example, that is simply not the case with ISIL. ISIL's magazine, English language magazine, which no longer exists in the form it did during the time of territorial control, Dabek spent a long time speaking about the use of child soldiers and noting quite positively that the world outside of their Islamic self-described Islamic State was very distressed at the sight of children, saying that the children of Sabah, which is a reference to a battle between the 7th and 9th centuries, which is the time when they regard Islam as being at its purest, in which they seek to return. Just as children were staining their swords with the blood of Yazidi Sarkut, the Firhan of the Ummah, so too were the children of the Khalifa, the Caliphate, stain their bullets with the blood of today's Taghut. So again, the children very, very much, they draw from what they see as a very conservative, radical line of hadiths and scholars to justify the use of children and children there on the front line and in trainings. Please move ahead. So I want to talk a little bit about how ISIL's use of child soldiers overlaps with and departs from commonly understood use of child soldiers, because there are obviously key core matters which align with what we've seen, for example, in some of the West African conflicts, and also the use of child soldiers by other terrorist groups, notably kind of the Taliban in Afghanistan and Boko Haram in Nigeria and the area around Nigeria. But the one thing to note that it does depart in many interesting ways. As this group will know, that the initial discussions surrounding the use of children in conflict in terms of the accountability setting revolve primarily around their presence in West African conflicts, most notably in Sierra Leone. I was a counsel at the court of Sierra Leone for 6 years and was there during the appeals hearing in relation to the placing of the recruitment and use of child soldiers as a serious violation of international law, and then the running of the child soldiers charges on the indictments in both the RUF, CDF and AFRC cases. Here, it fell very firmly within what was defined by the Paris Principles, which was a very pragmatic description of the use of child soldiers, looking at them not only as fighters, but also cooks, porters, messengers, spies, and for sexual purposes. In the conflicts in West Africa, in the Sierra Leone, we saw both use of boy soldiers and girl soldiers. And throughout this presentation, I will really be trying to gender it and not use the neutral term child soldiers, because I think ISIS's crimes are particularly gendered, both in terms of who perpetrates them and who suffers them. And they pivot strongly on gender and then secondarily on age. The recruitment and use, that's not me. The recruitment and use of child soldiers by terrorist groups mimics some of the testimony arising from, for example, SCSL on Sierra Leone and IC Uganda and DRC cases about the value of children's groups from high rates of attrition, high rates of battlefield attrition. They're just drawing it now more into the the umbrella of terrorist groups, there are, again, signs that terrorist groups in general have very similar reasons for drawing in children. With one Taliban fighting saying children are innocent, so they're the best tool against dark forces. So if we look at ISIL's short-term goals in recruiting and using child soldiers, this cleaves to many of the recognized objectives by belligerents in other armed conflicts. And so this will not be particularly news, I imagine, to anyone who's working on this call, but where there are high rates of attrition on the battlefield, you tend to see more child soldiers, boys being seen as more expendable than adult men. That was certainly true in ISIL on the battlefield. So ISIL's battlefield, and I suppose those that placed the front line, they made very strong distinctions as to who was more expendable than others. That group included, obviously, boys, who generally were not yet had skills that they needed at a time when the battlefront was raging and they were facing real threats to their caliphate, particularly, to be honest, in Syria, in the battles against the Syrian Kurdish forces. Also amongst the more expendable were foreign fighters who came into ISIL territory, who didn't have particular skills, who didn't speak Arabic, and who also didn't have recommendations linking them to more senior or mid-level commanders in ISIL. So one example of that would be, for example, I think the Portsmouth Six, who came out of England, who were 6 men, all with criminal records, all of them involved in low-level crime and violence and domestic violence against women. Again, very brand that carries across a number of foreign fighters that went into ISIL, but didn't speak Arabic, weren't highly educated, couldn't assist, for example, in engineering, medical, and so on. And they were all placed. They were also not particularly religious. The last book that they bought for flying to Turkey to cross over by land into Syria from Gatwick, W.H. Smith, was Islam for Dummies and the Quran for Dummies, the last purchases recorded on their card. And they then flew over and were killed within 6 weeks of landing, because they were placed on the front line. So ISIL did make a very clear sense of those who considered to be expendable, and among those were boys. Again, very common, the lack of fear amongst children make them uniquely suited to attacks, and particularly to suicide bombing. So you'll see in a lot of ISIL videos of training camps, videos of children practicing being suicide bombers. So wearing fake vests and running out and pulling cords and so on. Higher probability of success as children, and by children here we mean boys, are able to move closer into targets and into civilian areas. This was particularly used in the Battle of Kobani, which is a Syrian Kurdish city to the north near the border of Turkey. Of course, this does not really apply to girls. ISIL doesn't allow girls to move around without male guardians, or did not, rather, or allowed. So when we're talking about freedom of movement, it is extremely gendered freedom of movement. And as you'll see, ISIL doesn't actually have girl soldiers. There was some suggestion in the final stages of ISIL and its last gasp at Baghouz that they were used women, adult women, as in combat positions. That is still being understood, and the role of women in ISIL is being understood. But what is clear is that there's no indications from ISIL or from previous child soldiers and former child soldiers who were trained, meaning boy soldiers, that any girls were seen at ISIL training bases. Girls had other functions, which were also involved violations and harm. But within the bracket of recruitment and use and to participate actively in hostilities, that we see it as it's still a very male environment within ISIL. The military frontline environment remained very male. Where you start to see ISIL moving perhaps out of kind of the motivating factors that were common to the West African conflicts and into the late 90s, early 2000s West African conflicts, and more into the use of child soldiers as a terrorist group, sharing, for example, those aspects with Boko Haram, with AQI prior to them, is about spreading terror as a goal. So aside from actually the general inherent use of boys or children to fight because they are young, they don't fear death, and they're expendable. The use of children and boy soldiers in particular feature very heavily in ISIL propaganda. So ISIL invested a lot in highly produced, almost Hollywood-esque production videos showing kind of extreme brutality across the board, and particularly on executions. Children feature in two types of ISIL propaganda. One is about frontline propaganda, where you see children, boys, again, being trained, pictured holding weapons. More jarring, you see photos and videos of boys doing mock suicide bombings and other boys pretending to fall down and be killed by the suicide bomber. And in particular, boys performing the role of executioners of ISIL captives. So there are photos of child executioners, but we know that they're not necessarily all staged because, for example, when they took Palmyra for the second time and they executed people on the amphitheater dais in Palmyra, that they brought out a boy soldier who was estimated, I think, between 9 and 12 to carry out the execution. That obviously is a strong terrorizing effect on both national and international populations. The second use of children in propaganda relates to looking at life behind the lines, so life inside the self-described Islamic State while it held territorial control across northern Iraq and northern Syria. And there you'll see things like greetings from the Khalifa, for Eid greetings from the Khalifa, where you see a lot of children, often children of foreign fighters, giving Eid greetings in their own language, interspersed with videos of, for example, children at fun fairs, children swimming in the Islamic State, but always surrounded by guns and often involving children just walking down the street and through fun fairs, amusement parks, holding weapons, or close to indoctrination vehicles near kind of sites where children are likely to be, notably kind of swimming sites and so on. These have had a strong terrorizing effect on national and international populations and contained an implicit threat that children who are being indoctrinated, foreign children who are indoctrinated in the Islamic State, then potentially could be sent back into Europe. If you would just move the slide. So where I think it's important to start thinking about ISIL a bit differently than other terrorist groups is that ISIL, unlike AQI, like Al-Qaeda in Iraq or even Al-Qaeda generally, actually fell out with them over two things. The first was the attacking of the Shia and the idea that you would the focus on the near enemy rather than the far enemy being the Western world that attacked them. So ISIL coming down from essentially the split with al-Zarqawi had a strong focus on attacking the Shia, building upon a mix of Salafi jihadi ideology and the particular politics of Iraq post the 2003 invasion, the fall of the Sunni hegemony and the rise of Shia power in Iraq. But it also had a focus on the creation of a caliphate, which is quite controversial even within Salafi jihadi groups, but is really part of ISIL's core brand. There's quite an interesting kind of discussion between Mara Revkin and Jacob Aldot in the New York Times. What is ISIL without its territory? Does ISIL need territory to survive as a brand? And so ISIL's conduct should always be regarded through the prism of state building. They're not simply there to achieve military objectives, which are resource driven necessarily. They attempted to build a state that was meant to last throughout the ages. And part of that was an incredibly strong bureaucratic structure, an economic plan, an investment plan, environmental planning, social welfare planning. And so they were actually, in Mara Revkin's view of inhabitants of Mosul post ISIL's fall, many of them, although they abhorred ISIL's conduct and were not welcomed by ISIL, did note that they were able to actually run the city better than the Iraqi government was going to run in terms of stamping out corruption and doing things like picking up the garbage. Part of that is because a lot of ISIL come from within the Iraqi armed forces, from Saddam Hussein's armed forces, and joined the insurgency once the army was dissolved by, I think, Order 2, and during the debarkation campaign. So ISIL has children are really important to ISIL, not simply as vehicles of boy soldiers in particular, particularly important to ISIL. They invest a lot of time on ensuring that the next generation of the Caliphate is fully indoctrinated, that they're willing to protect the Caliphate and also expand the Caliphate's borders in their generation. They invest a lot of time and resources into outreach. Now, what do I mean by outreach? Well, I mean a number of different things. One is that they actually have child recruitment centers. They send, so speaking of present tense, it's because in my mind and for my work, I live in the period of 2014 to 2017. See, what they would do is they had child recruitment centers. They would send people out to speak to families, to have their children go to not necessarily training, but to lectures on jihad and the importance of fighting infidels. They would also set up events particularly for children, so notably amusement parks, handing out sweets in town squares, and speak to parents and their children about the importance of jihad, also to the souls of the children themselves. And they would, again, have mobile indoctrination units that would essentially be these small vehicles that would go around, that would park near areas where children would be, and again, distribute sweets and talk to the children themselves. Many of the parents, in terms of the recruitment happened, there was both voluntary and involuntary recruitment. And when I say voluntary recruitment, I mean either the children themselves were brought in by because they liked the uniforms and they liked the guns, and there was a degree of giving that children that agency if they would, once they were over 7 years old. In many cases, parents signed up their children, and that was particularly true of the parents of foreign fighters. So foreigners who had brought their children into the Caliphate were more likely, it seems, from some of the work that's being done by academics out of Yale and George Washington to volunteer their children to fight inside the Caliphate. For Iraqi and Syrian Sunni children, it was much more related to poverty and protection. So there's certainly different push factors seem to be dominate the local resources. ISIL paid soldiers very well. They paid the families of soldiers very well, including payments continuing after the death of the soldier, and that included adult soldiers, male soldiers, and boy soldiers. It also was, they felt like having someone who's linked to ISIL in the family meant you were less likely to be targeted by ISIL. So there was a measure of protection. But equally, there was a lot of forced transfer, even with forcible recruitment, even within the Sunni community, forcibly taking children to houses, threatening the families with harm if they didn't provide children to ISIL to train. The training themselves resulted in a lot of indoctrination, so a tremendous amount of indoctrination, both in terms of Quranic recitation, review of the Hadiths, discussions of jihad, but also a lot of exposing them to violence. That includes violence against Muslims, so videos of, for example, the war in Iraq, Americans' bombings of Afghanistan, creating and feeding them into a grievance narrative, and also exposing them to violence through videos of executions, for example, of who people they said they were infidels. Boys are taken from their families around age 7. Once they get to the age 7, that's when they take them in to be trained. As I said previously, there was a lot of implicit and explicit threats from children of foreign fighters that were made to camera, I think purposely by ISIL. So, for example, in August 2014, this is during ISIL's very rapid advance. So a young boy from Belgium was interviewed by his own father in front of an ISIL indoctrination unit near one of the rivers where you see children playing, saying that what he wants to be when he grows up is he wants to be is a jihadist so that he can kill the infidels of Europe. So again, noting the kind of the implicit threat of the children of foreign fighters. And if you can just flip over. So I want to turn now, because I've really been speaking a little bit about ISIL and Sunni children, both Sunni children who were born in Syria and Iraq and Sunni children who were brought in. But I want to turn very briefly now to just looking at children from minority communities, and specifically the Yazidi community. And the reason that we're looking specifically about the Yazidi community is because more is known about that community. The documentation there is more complete, and more of the Yazidi children have been rescued. But UNITAD is also trying to build up a picture about, for example, the Shabak, Shikakai, Shia Turkmen, and Christian children which have been less well documented in terms of what happened to the to boys who were taken in by ISIS. So this is a quote from an interview conducted by the Commission of Inquiry on Syria from their June 2016 report. They came to destroy ISIL crimes against the Yazidis. And this is by a Yazidi boy who was abducted by ISIL from Sinjar in August 2014 when he was aged 12. They told us we had to become good Muslims and fight for Islam. They showed us videos of beheadings, killing, and ISIL battles. My instructor said you have to kill kuffars, even if they are your fathers and brothers, because they belong to the wrong religion and they don't worship God. So if we flip over, I'll speak a little bit more about the minority. Oh, you have to go back one.
Would you like me to return to the previous slide?
Yeah, yeah. That's weird. You've missed. There's a slide that's missing. All right. Is there a slide that's hidden at all? No. Okay. All right. Okay. If you go back to the one, I'll then just speak about what's in the slide. Sorry. Just I'll put it up myself from my my copy. That's odd because I thought. So just in terms of ISIL's forced recruitment and training of children from the Yazidi community, there are some things that I think that are important to highlight here because they don't pair with the motivations of ISIL in relation to Sunni children entirely. What we see are some things which are, structurally it seems very similar. The separation of Yazidi boys who were abducted along with usually their mothers and other children because their fathers and older boys tended to be executed at the site of capture, leading, for example, to the mass graves that we've seen in Hardan and in Kocho, which is where Nadia Murad, the Nobel Prize winner of 2018, is from. So the Yazidi boys were separated from their mothers and siblings when they reached age 7 and forcibly separated because their mothers were usually in holding sites waiting to be registered and then sold. Until boys who are under 7 are sold as a package with their mothers, as are girls under 9. Once girls reach the age of 9, they were then sold as units for themselves in a system of enslavement and sexual enslavement. For boys, when they were age 7, they were removed from their mothers and transferred into indoctrination centers and then to training camps. So there was a movement of non-Sunni, non-Muslim boys into kind of indoctrination centers where they might stay for 6 months or more, not doing military training, but solely kind of learning about Islam as is interpreted by Daesh. The boys were then registered once they're in the training camps, the boys were registered and given Islamic names, and a new identity was forcibly imposed onto them at that time. They were trained alongside Sunni boys and given the same training in terms of the religious instruction, weapons training, military exercises, lectures on jihad, and so on. So on one level, the goals underlying the recruitment of Sunni and Yazidi boys were entirely the same. They were focused on improving ISIL's battlefield strength. They were drawing upon the lack of fear of death of children. And they were also trying to inculcate amongst them the next generation of the Caliphate. In one other interview that the Commission of Inquiry did, which is again was released through the report, the segment of that interview said, you know, children are not like adults. You know, their minds are soft, and we can change their minds. So again, this idea of the complete conversion and new identity and securing the future of the Caliphate, very present, even dealing with children who were originally not Sunni. However, on another level, which really targeted the children of the minorities, in this case, the children of the Yazidis specifically, ISIL aimed at destroying their religious identity and recasting them as followers of Islam. So it was not simply a matter of trying to increase battlefield strength or increase the next generation of the Caliphate. It was also the annihilation of a religious group that they did not believe to have the right to exist. And that was explained multiple times to the children there. And this way, Yazidi boys were transferred out of their community and through indoctrination and violence into the community of ISIL. This would fall within, and this is one of the things that UNITAD is also looking at quite keenly, this would fall within the 5th prohibited act of genocide, taken in the background of a complete kind of camp coordinated assault on the Yazidi community involving killing, serious bodily and mental harm, imposing measures to prevent births within the group, and the forcible transfer of children from the Yazidi community into the community of ISIL. And so that's, this is the end of the slides. We go to the questions, but I just wanted to mention 2 more things before I leave it open to questions. And I've done quite well. I think I've kept to the half hour. 2 more things I want to mention. The first is that the justice system, when it comes to crimes against soldiers, we have not generally seen any prosecutions for, there have been very few prosecutions in general, to be honest, criminal prosecutions, but there's been no criminal prosecutions for recruitment and use of child soldiers by ISIL, either in Iraq or elsewhere. And the reasons for this, are slightly different. In Iraq, there is simply no law under which you can charge this particular crime. Iraq has not brought into domestic law any international crimes, so you can't charge crimes against humanity, war crimes, or genocide as yet under Iraqi law. That is something that UNITAD is forging ahead on, because UNITAD's mandate requires it to be for criminal accountability. It cannot be involved in the trials under the anti-terror laws of 2005. To date, most of the trials there's been a tremendous roundup of people suspected to be ISIL, and by this we mean large swathes of the Sunni community who've been perceived either to be ISIL members or supportive being in ISIL. Supportive of ISIL. That has led to actually a feeding in of the sectarian divide and the grievances of the Sunni community, because a lot of the Sunni communities simply had no choice. ISIL kind of landed on top of them. They were trying to survive a very bad situation. So you have people being arrested who ran a tea house that ISIL members went to. Equally, you have, for example, women who've been sentenced to years in jail for feeding their husbands who they were forcibly married to by cooking food and feeding them. Among those include children. And so we've seen particularly a distinction between how authorities in both Iraq and Syria, and by Syria I mean, of course, the Syrian Kurdish authorities and not the Syrian national government, because they're the ones in the control ISIL areas. But there is a distinction as to how child soldiers from the Sunni background and child soldiers from the Yazidi background and other minority backgrounds are treated. When they capture or they arrest someone who they believe to be suspected of being an ISIL member or supportive of an ISIL member who is underage and male, if you are a Sunni boy, you are detained with the adult men and you are put into very, very poor detention facilities in Iraq, where torture has been documented as being rife, where the detention conditions are life-threatening in some instances, and where you're being held with adult men. If you are a Yazidi child soldier and you are immediately identified as Yazidis, or you're identified as Yazidi at any point in the process, you are taken out of the system of imprisonment and detention, returned to a community, and to the extent that where that exists, you are provided with psychosocial support and services, although those are lacking. But there's definitely a distinction in view. In terms of being abroad, although there's jurisdiction under the laws, we just haven't found cases where child soldiers have been brought in these jurisdictions. We have found some cases. There's one case in Germany involving a child who has killed, a female child who was killed and she was essentially a slave within an ISIL household, but again, not a child soldier's case. The second thing I wanted to mention is around impact on children, which I also haven't covered here. But UNITAD obviously regards child soldiers. We recognize that child soldiers is a crime, but it's also a basket of violations, right? It's a child that has been subjected to the recruitment and use has been subjected usually to torture. They might have been starved, they have been usually forcibly transferred, there are elements of enslavement within the child soldier experience. And while this hasn't yet been documented in the case of ISIL, but but we're continuing to look into that. There's often sexual violence which is involved in child soldiering as well. So we recognize it as a basket of violations, and also that the violations may themselves be age disaggregated. So we're also looking at, for example, the experience of boy soldiers between the ages, for example, of 7 to 11, and then as they become older into the teenage years, in terms of the roles, the training, and what they were expected, the roles they're expected to perform for ISIL. When we've been documenting trauma in the interviews that we have a dedicated team of experienced people, largely drawn, in fact, from national and international jurisdictions, who work on doing interviews with children and work on investigating crimes against children, including through measures other than interviewing the children themselves, of course. We're seeing high rates of trauma. Within the Sunni community, again, indoctrination continues to be a problem. The children continue to be a threat in this community. Some of them maintain contact with commanders. Within the Yazidi community, we see a split. Some of them have recognized themselves as Yazidis, and have kind of retained a religious and cultural identity, which has eased their path back into their community. For others, they're entirely indoctrinated. Some of them no longer speak Kurdish, which would be their mother tongue. They speak Arabic, or in some cases, German, Russian, and so on, depending on who their commanders was, the unit was, and where they were living. For those children, it's been a very uphill task, because they see their community very much as infidels who don't have the right to exist. That includes shouting at women who are uncovered. In one instance, there was an intervention because a child had confided in a humanitarian worker who happened to be Muslim, and so he saw him as being on his side, that he planned to kill his family because they were infidels, and he did not believe. He believed that was what he was being told that he had to do. So there continue to be ripples of tremendous trauma throughout the child population, which is not well recognized. There's been much more resourcing. Not that we're talking about a hierarchy of victims, but where we've seen more resourcing has been actually to female victims of violence, whereas adult males, and here we're speaking actually mainly about survivors of executions rather than members of ISIL, have not received it, but also child soldiers, boy soldiers particularly, are viewed with suspicion. They're not entirely accepted either from the Sunni community or the minority communities, and they continue to struggle with trauma, and also with the continued indoctrination, or the continued kind of existence of the Caliphate, which lives on inside their heads. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sareta, for such an interesting and comprehensive presentation. And thank you very much for your critical work also. I would like now to open the floor for your questions. And please, if you have any question for Sareta, introduce yourself briefly to her.
Hi, Sareta. Ian Bradbury here. I'm with the First NAF. Question related to the programs that may be in place. You mentioned that there are some psychosocial supports for the boys returning to Yazidi communities. I'm wondering if you know of any dedicated programs that were specifically designed for boys in that space.
I do not. I mean, this falls within the humanitarian field. We have our own psychologists on team, but they're there to ensure that people are able to be interviewed by UNITAD. Like they're in a place kind of emotionally, psychologically, where interviewing is not a harm to them. But within the wider community, there is not dedicated psychosocial support, as far as I'm aware, for former child soldiers. The Yazidi groups, notably Yazda, they have a person who's in touch with former child soldiers, but the support then is really to the families to be able to cope with having basically a former child soldier kind of return to them saying, well, you're back home now, you'll be fine. And then of course it's not fine. So no, it doesn't. I mean, again, I would see to speaking to the Yazidi groups about whether more funding has been granted for that purpose, but there certainly seems to be a kind of reluctance to dedicate funding to children who are victims, but who may also be perpetrators. So again, a lot of suspicion.
Absolutely. I actually gave a TEDx on that just a year and a half ago, the exact topic. And I was just wondering if maybe there'd been something changed in the window. I haven't heard of any either. So I still cross my fingers and hope that we'll see that at some point in time. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's all right. I would though encourage you to speak to probably people who are working within the psychosocial support community, because there may be, streams of things happening or beginning to happen of which I personally am not aware.
For sure. Cheers. Thank you.
Yeah.
I would have a question for you, Sareta, if you don't mind.
Sure.
We know that the Islamic State has created an holistic, immersive, and also systematic strategy to indoctrinate the young generation by coercive and non-coercive means, including also by administering existing educational institutions and amending the school curricula as to reflect ideological precepts and military training. We also know, as you mentioned in your presentation, that children in Islamic State ranks were indoctrinated to an acute adherence to Salafi jihadi ideology and the rippling effect that this has on a child development capacity. I wanted to ask you, how is UNITAD supporting children on the ground to overcome trauma, stigma, and also rehabilitation and reintegration efforts for those children who have been recruited locally by the Islamic State?
Sure. So I'll answer that question in two ways. First, I do want to make clear that UNITAD has a very specific and narrow mandate which is directed towards accountability. So we don't, for example, have a humanitarian arm of the mandate which does, for example, training on rehabilitation, integration, and psychosocial support, because there are other entities that do that, but we're really directed towards understanding what crimes are committed, gathering that crime into dossiers, and those dossiers then being used to be basis for national prosecutions, potentially international prosecutions, but that path is not yet, the path to justice at international level is not yet clear. That said, I would say two further things. One, it is hope that through our documentation of crimes, there is a better understanding of children, child soldiers, boy soldiers, in the case of ISIL, being victims rather than perpetrators. So understanding, there's such a lack of understanding about the role of children and such fear of the children who have survived, that has overwhelmed, I think, a rational understanding of what those children were put through by ISIL. So in building those cases, we're hoping to also be able to give people who are being driven largely by emotion and fear, and largely driven by fear, to be honest, and which is understandable given what people suffered in Iraq and the fact that ISIL attacks in Iraq are still ongoing. A bit more of a rational basis to try and understand the child soldier experience and understand that it's a long path from being indoctrinated back into their communities. The second thing is that through the Office of the Special Advisor, there is this he does a lot of advocacy and messaging, including inside Iraq and then also outside Iraq. And one of the things that we try and frame within that messaging is the need to support these children who were forcibly trained and recruited by Daesh. And that includes doing community outreach at local levels, but it also means having that conversation, for example, with senior religious leaders, with kind of community leaders who, if you can change their minds, it also then assists in leading the community onwards. So that can be anything from, religious leaders to even village leaders looking at resistance to taking children back. We're also looking at, within the Iraqi justice system, as I said, we have a capacity building issue, and that involves addressing potential areas of the Iraqi system which fail to live up to fair trial rights, fail to live up to international standards. And one of those things that also includes, for example, the prosecution of children for crimes committed while they were children, not recognizing the victimhood of children within the justice system themselves, and more immediately, of course, removing children from detention centers where they are housed with adults. And again, here I'm speaking about boys housed with men. So, yes.
Thank you.
Not a complete answer to your question, but
of course,
answer.
no, of course, I had a follow-up because we know that children do not join terrorist groups because of a fascination to Salafi jihadi ideology, but this is what they are left with as a consequence of their exploitation. And also in addition to that, the potential partake of these children in acts of violence. And this issue gives rise to the perception of children recruited by the Islamic State or by other terrorist groups as a serious security threat, and imposes also severe limitation on their capacity to afford the system of protection that is prescribed by the rule of law that is normally afforded to children who have been recruited in armed forces. And we have also seen the adversarial impact that this has had on informed decision making by European states, for instance, with respect to the repatriation and rehabilitation of children. And you mentioned that UNITAD is conducting advocacy on the ground in order to build consensus on the fact that these children are in fact victims of a war crime primarily, and not perpetrators of violation of international law. How do you believe that how important do you believe these efforts are on the ground? And how do you think that the international community could support to help reshape the perception of these children as purely perpetrator of human rights abuses and as a security threat instead of children who were innocent and recruited forcefully and indoctrinated to perpetrate acts of violence?
So I would say this. I would always try and divorce the issue of whether a child is a security threat or not from the issue of whether they should be repatriated and rehabilitated. Because I think when it comes to ISIL, I think we need to be quite forthright in saying that some of these children would be seen potentially correctly as security threats. We've had children make threats to kill their families. We have children who have been shown to be planning attacks. They have been through a tremendous, that doesn't make them necessarily, it doesn't make them there's no reason to be less empathetic with those children at all, but that we also have to look at the consequences of indoctrination by Daesh and say this is going to take resources and time to undo. And that, there are security implications for at least some of the children that we need to be aware of. And that extends to the documentation community. If you're going to be in a room with a former indoctrinated child soldier, you need to be aware that that is a different risk than going into a room, for example, with a victim of sexual violence or with a survivor of a mass killing. That's just an unfortunate impact of what these children have been put through. On the other hand, when we're speaking about the repatriation of children, I think there's no one who works on these issues that feels that what the international community, not all of the international community, but what the bulk of the international community is doing is helpful. We have a number of children that are in Iraqi prisons. Obviously, UNITAD doesn't work in Syria, but your comment obviously refers to the situation in Al Hul camp and the camps in Syria where we have a large population which is underage. We also have a population that is existing then in a situation where there is consistent indoctrination because they're living amidst people who are still quite radicalized and are growing older within that indoctrinated community. But the reason I want to separate the issue of the security threat from the return is that if you are a child that has a citizenship to a country, or either by descent or by birth, there is that you can't be simply rejected by your country and left to founder in what has become kind of essentially an ISIL occupied camp in eastern Syria. So we would obviously for those children, it's I said UNITAD doesn't have a humanitarian arm, and I want to be quite careful in the sense of not crossing over into my personal opinions about Al Hul camp, because it's not something that UNITAD works on because of our mandate is so Iraq focused. But certainly, I mean, the repatriation of children continues to be something that preoccupies a lot of the United Nations and a lot of the civil society organizations, to move them to a place where they can actually receive treatment and care, and which to be honest is less physically dangerous to themselves as well. There have been quite high rates of child deaths in these camps, just as a result of the living conditions and lack of medical care. Certainly it's no place for a child to grow up.
Thank you, Sarita. Are there any other questions?
Yes, please, Cecilia.
Yes, please.
Sarita, thank you very much for a brilliant presentation. My name is John Essen. I'm founder of GlowSpy. GlowSpy is a UK-based security think tank. Now, my question is about the gender distinctions you alluded to earlier on. And I just wanted to find out if there are some lessons you've gleaned from those distinctions that could be integrated into say, a solution-oriented response approach in terms of rehabilitation and integration of these children when they're recovered, to get them back into society so they can function properly.
Yes, I suppose two things. One, I would say when you're looking at child soldiers in particular, rather than kind of the gendering of the entire scope of criminal activity by ISIL, that when you're looking at child soldiers, it's very homogenous. It's very male. Very rarely will you see any women. There's no women in the ISIL structure, for example, the military structure or civil government structures, and there are no women as far as we can discern, even at the training bases, even in strictly gender role capacities around cooking. They don't seem to exist either. Obviously, documentation is continuing, but this is where we are at the moment. That's with probably some very notable exceptions, such as Sayaf, who was interviewed by Martin Chulov of The Guardian, and he had a short podcast about his experience of interviewing her. She really came from jihadi royalty. Her father was a very prominent jihadist. She married the ISIL minister of oil. So she appeared to be in some conversations, or at least in the house where conversations were happening. That was generally not the experience of females in ISIL whatsoever, who were really seen as being reproductive agents, married off very closely and then remarried very fast on death. There's no room for single women and single independent women in ISIL society. When it comes to the rehabilitation of child soldiers, the one thing I would say that where gendering can help is looking at separating out for these gender roles. ISIL had very, very strict gender roles, which were kind of brutally enforced. So unpacking the issue of gender roles is going to be quite important. Challenging child soldiers' understanding of the place of kind of women and men in society, I think, is probably an easier entry point into having them reflect on the legitimacy of ISIL propaganda, because often with their mothers and their sisters, they would want better treatment for their mothers and their sisters than ISIL would have allowed. That's one thing to think of. The other thing I would say is that I don't know if gender is necessarily the best way of understanding it. I would always choose age and try and do an age disaggregated analysis of what children experienced. So for example, the experience of children who are younger, 7 and 9, where they might have lived more in commanders' houses, they might have been subjected to longer periods of indoctrination. They may have performed different roles than, for example, 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds, and therefore that might inform how rehabilitation, reintegration might operate. But again, very much we come from a criminal accountability framework, so we're not focused as much. So I'm a bit hesitant, as I'm not an expert in any way on rehabilitation and reintegration of former child soldiers. But just in terms of the documentation we're doing, the differences seem to lie. The experience of males seems to be pretty uniform, whereas the distinction seems to be what they're exposed to at different age ranges within ISIL.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Thank you.
The only thing I say is, if you wanted, there's a Vice documentary. I would not normally tell people to look at anything that involved ISIL videos, because they're actually very distressing and purposely distressing. But the video, Vice did a documentary, which I think is on YouTube now, split into 5 parts. And from there, there's one section of the 5 parts that looks specifically at ISIL and children. And you can see quite clearly, for those who haven't seen it, you can see quite clearly the outreach to children in quite kind of insidious and preying upon kind of children's desire for adult attention, and also, to be honest, carbohydrates and sugar. And then you also see the impact of the foreign fighters. So you see a lot of foreign fighters then speaking to their children about how much they want them to become jihadists. So I think when you're looking at push-pull factors, it's quite interesting, the breakdown between children of foreign fighters versus kind of local children.
Thank you so much. That cleared a lot up for me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The other thing I would add is that, you know, ISIL had this structure of what they call a total organization. So within the Caliphate itself, that you can think of the Caliphate almost as a sealed room. For us outside, a dystopia. For those inside who believe in Salafi jihadist ideology, a kind of utopia in the making. Part of that is that there is no reference to the outside world inside the Caliphate. Initially, at the beginning, there was a bit of internet. They cut that internet quite quickly because they felt it was helping people to pinpoint, for example, drone strikes and so on. And so there was no basis, if you were a child, to understand anything other than what was saying. Yeah. Within the child soldier experience, that went even a step further, because although all the adults are sealed in this caliphate together and cut off from the outside world, child soldiers are removed from their families entirely, taken to chain camps, and then that connection with the family is largely cut, it seems. So even within the experience of the child soldier, their bubble, even within the general bubble of the caliphate, is much smaller and it's full of people who are complete adherents to ISIL. You're talking about training commanders, battlefield commanders, other trainers, junior trainers in the camps. They're not going to come into contact with people who are lukewarm about ISIL, who are just trying to survive this period of time in Iraq and Syria. They're there with the true adherents of ISIL 24/7, full time, who have become now their family, particularly for boys 7, 8, 9, who really, you know, they can't exist by themselves during that time anyway. So they are dependent on the adults around them. All the adults around them are essentially adult men who are true believers. So that's what they grew up in, within this framework of total organization of life.
Yeah, thank you, Sareta. Thank you so much for that.
Is there any other question for Sareta? I have another question, Sareta, for you.
Sure.
If you don't mind again. You mentioned during your presentation that the Islamic State targets children starting from 7 years of age. The first question I have for you is, why is it that so? And also, as a matter of prosecution, when referring particularly to the Sunni children, does this mean that these children at 7 years of age, depending on the age of criminal accountability, that will be exposed to detention?
So the reason why it's boys of 7 and girls of 9 in terms of when they're seen as coming into playing more adult roles into society. It relates to kind of an interpretation of a hadith about a battle that occurred in the 7th and 9th century, about the involvement of children in the battles in the earliest years of Islam, when the Arabian Peninsula was in a state of extreme conflict at the time. So that's where it comes from. That's why that particular age is chosen. It's also why you see kind of girls being moved into sexual enslavement at age 9 as well. So I mean, with ISIL, there's usually something they found somewhere in the kind of, in their view of the theology, which is this very, very narrow line of hadiths within the Salafi jihadi school of thought, that prompts them to say that this is what we can do versus this is what we have to do, and this is also very legitimate to do. Like I said, I mean, some of the things when we were working on criminal accountability for ISIL, one of the things which is quite odd, I think, as someone who works on kind of international crimes, is that ISIL doesn't try to hide their international crimes. ISIL is like incredibly proud. They don't try to reframe their crimes in any way. They don't try to say, well, you know, these children were orphans and we needed to take care of them, and they were not really, they were just playing around with guns, but really they were going to school and they were helping. And if they were cooking for us, it was only because they were helping our wives to cook. There's none of that. That doesn't exist there's no kind of reframing action by ISIL. It's very much like, we use them for children, the child soldiers. This is why we use them. This is what they were to us. And we do it again because we think it's important and it's allowed. So sorry, this has now gone off on tangent. And you said the second part of your question was aside from why the ages, it was in relation to.
You mentioned that there is a difference in treatment between Sunni children and Yazidi children.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you if that 7 years old is set as a minimum age of criminal accountability, or if that has any impact on these children's possibility to be exposed to detention and tortured, as you mentioned, or how are those principles of juvenile justice applying in this context?
So obviously seven on capture, and then had to be taken into indoctrination and then training, military training, and then sent out to fight. So usually they're not 7 anymore generally, because the last years of ISIL battle, they weren't doing training. They were just fighting for their lives after losing territorial control in Iraq in 2017 and then in Syria in March 2018 during the flight. But yes, I mean, there are children who are detained who are 11, 12, who are detained as ISIL members and who regard themselves as ISIL members, who don't necessarily want to be taken apart from their commanders either, in some of the reporting. In the case of those on trial, I myself am not aware of a child who's appeared in court. I mean, when I say child, I mean a younger child. Certainly we've seen 16, 17-year-olds who've been charged. Whether that's just simply because there are thousands of people in the justice system and there's just like thousands of people in detention rather than necessarily paying attention to them as children, I'm not sure. I'd have to get back to you on that. Mm-hmm. I mean, part of it is seeing what the kind of Iraqi justice system how they will cope. I don't think there is a desire to put 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds on trial. But, if you're dealing with mass arrests and trying to identify children who are in detention, it becomes a little bit more problematic. So the issue is, I think, less about prosecutions in court and more about the fact that they're being held in detention in kind of adult male detention centers in poor conditions. Keep in mind that a lot of these children, if they were taken with ISIL all the way to Baghouz, they may no longer know where their families are. Their families may not be alive. They may not necessarily remember very much about their families whatsoever. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago had one of the highest per capita rates of recruitment into ISIL of adults in the world. I mean, that's partly per capita because we're a very small island. And so even if you send 3 people, we get quite a high per capita rate. But nevertheless, when 2 children, 2 boys who were age, I think 7 and 9 when they came back, it was in actually the press because Clive Stafford Smith was involved and he got Pink Floyd involved somehow in helping get these children out. They were actually found on the side of the road by Kurdish armed forces because their father had been killed and their stepmother was Belgian, hadn't wanted to bring them along, had kind of abandoned them on the side of the road. So they went into a camp barrage where the ISIL children are placed in, but they didn't know the name of their parents either at that time. They couldn't remember their father's or their mother's names. They were too young. They just knew them as mum. Luckily, they had a photograph and if you're their mother, they'd been abducted by the father, so the mother was still here. But if you are a covered, a hijab Black Muslim woman in Trinidad, it's not too difficult to track you down here. So someone just came with a photograph and just went around to the community and found the mother quite quickly, and that's how they were reunited. But for a lot of the Iraqi children, if their immediate family has been taken away from their immediate family at age 7, been with their commander is now being killed, like actually just tracing the family is going to be not an inconsiderable challenge.
Thank you, Sareta. Are there any other questions from CRTG working group members?
Yes, I have a question. I'm Connie from CTG. You mentioned that one reason there had been no criminal prosecutions for recruitment of children in Iraq is because the legal framework is not in place yet. If or when this is established, would this enable crimes to be tried in retrospect, or would it just be in place for future crimes?
So I think if it's an international crime, it can be tried in retrospect, and that's just not so much in retrospect. I think that's probably the wrong framing, but in the Special Court for Sierra Leone, of course, you know, there was that crime wasn't recognized explicitly, it wasn't codified rather in international law. And so there was an argument about that this was a crime in international law, it just hadn't been codified in international law, and that was successful, that did exist. And so, you know, the fact that the crime exists in international law, the fact it doesn't necessarily exist inside the courts in Iraq, I think would not necessarily be a bar. Otherwise, there would be no point UNITAD existing, since the whole point is that we're supposed to be leading criminal prosecutions in Iraq. I should say it's not just against crimes against child soldiers, it's all international crimes. So currently, as I said, the trials are taking place under the anti-terror laws of 2005. Those laws recognize essentially membership and association with the armed group. In some of the trials that have taken place, for example, in Talqif near Mosul or in Court in northern Baghdad, you know, you see ISIL members who are trying to explain because they're trying to essentially offload responsibility or explain their minimal role in the structure, where there's kind of incontrovertible evidence that they were members of ISIS because they posted videos, their photos, and so on. Where they're trying to explain their role, in which you'd think like this is evidence of crimes. This is evidence of other people who were committing crimes, of the command structure. That could potentially include evidence of, for example, how training bases worked, which is not as clear. What happened to the children at certain points in time, how children of different ages were treated within the ISIS military framework. Unfortunately, because those trials only look at membership and association, they don't care. Not care is the wrong word, but there's no reason for the judges to investigate the underlying crimes that those men have been involved in, or information those men have about others who were in the structure potentially committing crimes. So that narrative is being lost. There's a good article in the New Yorker that dates from November 2018, I think, around 24th November issue 2018, which looks at the kind of the path to justice and makes a lot of, and Human Rights Watch has also done more reporting. The New Yorker one's a bit more compelling to read, to be honest, but by Ben Taub, about these trials, where these are 15-minute trials. People come in, they stand up, you know, there's the defense lawyer meets them for the first time, they have the trial, then they're sentenced either to death or to long periods in custody in Iraqi detention. So the actual trial system means that we're not capturing an understanding of what happened in the crimes across the board. We're not capturing the understanding of the command structures, and also specifically, we're not capturing the idea of what happened to children. And I would say within the accountability framework, you know, obviously there are a number of different victims, but with the justice framework often affects, when I say the justice framework, the priority of looking at crimes, even within a criminal accountability system, often reflects levels of power in society. And we see that very clearly. For example, you know, sexual violence in domestic jurisdictions has largely become almost, rape, for example, is largely decriminalized in most national jurisdictions, which is quite a radical way of saying it. But if you look at the UK, rape convictions, for example, hover around 4%. So, you know, largely I would say decriminalized. Where you see inequalities in power in who is prosecuted, what they're prosecuted for, what their sentences for, that's then reflected in charging decisions. And where you see communities that have been historically marginalized, or subgroups even within the populations of victims that have been historically marginalized, and maybe chief among them are children who have the added burden of not being under the age of the majority, and therefore not able to advocate upon themselves. They don't have organizations of children that go to do this kind of advocacy. They're still reliant on adults to advocate for them. Within the justice system, you see an invisibilization of crimes that particularly affect children. And so there has been this movement to ensure that there's specific focus on children. So for example, in UNITAD, there's a gender and children's unit, crimes against children unit, to ensure that the number of crimes against adults and an adult-centric understanding of ISIL's conduct doesn't dominate, and that children kind of are left to decide. That said, it is an area of ISIL criminal activity which is not well understood. Of course, we understand that they have child soldiers because they produced endless videos about it, and they spoke to camera about it, and they put the children themselves on camera, including children committing kind of quite horrific executions, including kind of beheadings. But, you know, we also have to ask ourselves, if ISIL is producing it, that does not necessarily give an accurate picture of what they were doing. Like ISIL stuff is produced for consumption by non-ISIL audiences. And therefore you have to question, not necessarily the veracity of it, but the purpose of it in that way and the extent to which it's framed in a particular way for a terrorizing purpose. What we really need to understand is what it was like inside the Caliphate and what the children went through, and understand the level of nuance, and not from ISIL themselves what was happening. And that's proved to be very difficult for a couple of reasons. One is that actually getting children who were members of ISIL were members of the organization. So they weren't, they crossed the line between kind of being damaged and harmed by the organization and being members of the organization. So getting them to explain what happened to them is often very difficult, because they don't always regard it as a crime. They don't always see the harm. There are inherent difficulties in interviewing children anyway. A lot of them just will not pass the witness vulnerability system to be safely interviewed. And so under the do no harm principle, they wouldn't be interviewed. But also, to be honest, a lot of children died. You know, of the communities that survived the ISIL Caliphate, it was those who were on the front lines and those who were armed, who were obviously least most likely to be killed as the Caliphate collapsed. And that included a large number of children who obviously were seen as the most expendable on the front line, and also the least frightened of dying when dying was all but a certainty as ISIL began to kind of peter out. So there are definite challenges between understanding children used by ISIL, and we're moving now from an understanding based on what ISIL has told us and ISIL has made available to us, to questioning that and trying to get an understanding from those who were inside the Caliphate, including children, but not only children.
Thank you very much.
Sareta, I have a very last question for you.
Great.
UNITAD was established following the need, as emphasized by the international community, of the crucial importance of holding senior members of the Islamic State accountable for the crimes that they have committed. Would you like to say a few words on the future steps for UNITAD with respect to the possibility of providing the evidence that you're collecting to a domestic courts, or perhaps the opportunity for the creation of an hybrid tribunal, if you see any?
Yes, so the first thing I would say that ISIL, UNITAD is already assisting with prosecutions. So that has largely been reactive at the moment, because we're still in quite an early stage of documentation on the ground. But we're already assisting multiple national jurisdictions across the world, where they have inquiries about people in custody, or where they're running investigations, including sometimes structural investigations where no arrests have yet been made. That has involved looking through ISIL. UNITAD has quite a huge holding of evidence already that includes kind of call records and information that was collected from Mosul during the fall of ISIL, a large number of ISIL internal documents, all of which we have available to us to make sense of the structure of ISIL, and to compare the effective structure to the de jure structure, as well as trying to understand more about the training camp system, for example, an indoctrination center system. So that is already occurring. What we would hope to see, and what we intend to build towards, is moving from, for example, responding reactively to requests from states, to building our own case dossiers, which are then available to any state, so that you don't necessarily have to wait till someone's arrested to start the investigation. The aim is that if someone is arrested, or is already arrested, for example, senior figures of ISIL in the Iraqi system predominantly, that can then, the prosecutors are already equipped with material on which to begin a very in-depth investigation. With Iraq in particular, we are looking to ensuring that the crimes that the substantive crimes are enshrined in Iraqi law. That could be done in one of two ways. The first way is that Parliament actually just passes them into law, which sounds like the easier way, but in fact is probably not the easier way at the moment in Iraq. The second is that you would essentially create a special chamber in the courts of Iraq, similar to what exists, for example, in Qatar now, which could be entirely Iraqi. It could potentially be hybrid, depending on if the Iraqi authorities wanted that international assistance, and that is something that would be entirely within the remit of the Iraqi authorities as to what they wanted. With regard to a path to international justice, at the moment, there is no path to international justice. The ICC is obviously not engaged. Iraq is not going to become a party to the ICC. America would not in any way support Iraq becoming a party to the ICC, because you can't say like, well, Iraq will be a party, but only for ISIL crimes. That doesn't exist in the ICC. So if you bring in, if Iraq becomes a party, then it also opens up the specter of American involvement in Iraq, Shia militias in Iraq, and so on, making it very politically challenging. In regard to the hybrid tribunal, I mean, Sweden had voiced, had put forward assertion about having an ISIL tribunal located like somewhere outside of Europe, but probably like somewhere in a place like Cyprus, for example. So outside the Middle East, outside of Europe, but close enough to both of them. That was really the Swedish suggestion has made kind of what made at the time waves in the community that was less involved. And it was seen as kind of maybe this is a path forward for actual and international form of accountability. Really, the Swedish suggestion didn't come from a place of necessarily wanting justice for victims, as much as it came from a place of not wanting to try Swedish foreign fighters in Sweden. So they wanted to find some place where they could try them, they could take them out of where they were being held, largely in Syria, and try them, but not have to bring them back home in Sweden. And we've not seen that idea progress. So a hybrid tribunal is possible, but again, there doesn't seem to be a ton of political will. And to be honest, in this climate and given what's happening in the world, there's not a pile of resources that are sitting around waiting to be spent on ISIL trials, as much as the international criminal lawyers would like that to be the case. The only thing I would say is that when people speak about international justice at an international level, I think people should really be reminded that the international trials have such a small number of people prosecuted. You know, the Special Court for Sierra Leone hybrid tribunal prosecuted 13 people. You know, we're not going to go back to the ICTR, ICTY days of prosecuting like 100 different perpetrators. So as a justice which allows you to understand what the crimes are, which provides kind of a sense of understanding and closure to the entire victim community, international trials, I think they certainly serve a purpose, but they will only generally have the funds and the mandate to focus on those who are alleged to bear the greatest responsibility. So there is a reason still, I wouldn't regard somehow as national trials as being second tier. Certainly that is not the case. In fact, national prosecutors often have a lot of experience in doing war crimes and international criminal trials in national jurisdictions. And also it allows you to just prosecute many more people. That's what the national system is set up for. So if the ending of ISIL is 10 people being prosecuted in a hybrid tribunal, in a fictional hybrid tribunal in Cyprus, that may work for the international community for a variety of reasons. Whether that would work for the communities in Iraq and Syria, I think is more.
Thank you very much, Sareta, for your presentation and for your insightful comments, and also for your kindness in attending this meeting and for your time.
Thank you.
I look very much forward to other opportunities to engage with you and UNITAD. And I was also wanted to thank you, the strategy working group members, for having attended this meeting.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sareta. Thank you, Sareta.
Hope to cross paths on this topic in other fora.
Hopefully, Sareta. Thank you so much once again. Take good care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.